In this lesson, we'll be talking about another of the argument tasks you'll find pertaining to critical reasoning style questions on the verbal section of the executive assessment exam. And those are the ones that ask you to evaluate an argument, ultimately in one of two ways. So let's first just recap the question logistics for critical reasonings on the executive assessment. Remember that you want to assume that the section has 3 to 5 critical reasonings in the 14-question verbal section. You're going to have somewhere between 1 to 3 critical reasonings in each 7-question half. You'll have a single paragraph pertaining to a unique question task for each of these problems. And strategically, you want to assume about 2.5 minutes per question on average because these require the closest read. You'll want to hold yourself, though, to a pretty strict 3-minute maximum for any critical reasoning style question in the EA. You'll want to note the task of the question before you engage with the paragraph prompt, and you'll consider skipping your critical reasonings on the first pass through either half to ensure that you see all of the questions, since you can skip and return on this exam. You'll want to take targeted notes to force engagement and proactively address the specific question task. And this is going to be the primary question format to guess and skip in the second half if you have under 15 minutes remaining after question 7. So let's talk about evaluating an argument. So first, there are 2 methods of evaluating an argument on the EA. The first one is going to ask you to find new information to help evaluate the validity of the argument. It's going to use terms like helpful or useful. You can also be asked to evaluate what is known as the method of argument, and this will have terms such as the point of the argument, talk about how the argument proceeds or what the purpose of the argument is. And then, or pieces of the argument, as it were. And then for the strategic implications, we need to carefully consider the question phrasing to properly identify what type of evaluation is being required by this task. You'll want to specifically identify the conclusion or multiple conclusions of the argument or arguments, and that's because sometimes there's more than one speaker for evaluate the argument tasks. If you're seeking additional information to help you evaluate the argument's validity, you'll want to identify the type of argument, as you do normally, to try to broadly predict relevant evidence. But if you're being asked to evaluate the method of the argument, you'll instead want to carefully track the facts and opinions by ultimately diagramming the argument, as it were, using the argumentation equation on your scratchpad. You do have to be aware of introducing variables outside of the argument that are not directly related to the conclusion. And, of course, you can eliminate more quickly if the choices begin to match, or as one of the choices matches your prediction. So now let's take a look at the argumentation equation just for reflection. So we know that all arguments lead up to a conclusion, which is going to be the explicit subjective opinion that requires support. You have your premise, which is going to be your objective facts that are providing the support required by the conclusion. And then your assumption is going to be the unstated facts that must be true to link your premise to your conclusion logically. And that's ultimately what you're being asked to evaluate if you're being asked to evaluate the validity of an argument. So when you're looking for the right answer for evaluating the validity question task, you need to locate additional information that would help determine whether the implicit assumption or assumptions linking the premises to the conclusion are likely or not likely to be true. So you basically want to see, well, if this is true, I believe the argument more. If the answer to this question is false, I believe the argument less. And of course, arguments, as always, can be categorized in multiple ways, but focusing closely on the specifics of the premise or premises can help to broadly predict the type of evidence needed to evaluate that conclusion. So our common argument evaluation is going to basically require us to ask some questions. For instance, for an analogy where we know that the argument means that basically A is equal to B, you want an answer that helps to determine whether the items are comparable in relevant ways. For representation-based arguments, you need to have an answer to the question, does the sample represent the larger whole? For data and evidence interpretation style arguments, you need information to help answer, can the data or evidence be interpreted some other way? For causality arguments, you need an answer that would help to determine whether there are other possible causes or outcomes, or if the circumstance is merely coincidental. And for plan or recommendation-based arguments, you need to consider whether the execution is necessary and whether the approach will reasonably work, and the correct answer should help you to determine the answer to these questions definitively. So now let's take a look at an example. So as always, we begin by reading the question stem, and here we've got which of the following would it be most useful to establish in order to evaluate the argument above. So obviously we see the word evaluate, which helps to indicate and evaluate the argument task, but we also have most useful, which just means what's useful. And so we need to now go read the paragraph to determine what the argument is that we need to evaluate. So starting with, many people believe that humans have an almost psychic intuition that allows them to know when they are being watched. This belief has been corroborated by a recent study in which 100 individuals were each seated alone in a room with a one-way window pane and asked whether they were being watched from behind the window pane. The subjects correctly determined whether they were being watched 80% of the time. Okay, so we've got our argument, and we know that there's some evidence, and we've got the study. So that tells us that we need to evaluate said study and the evidence or data that it presents. Then we want to note the explicit conclusion. And of course, the conclusion is this belief has been corroborated by a recent study, but I need to know what that belief is. And it's the sentence prior that many people believe that humans have an almost psychic intuition that allows them to know when they are being watched. So then we want to broadly predict what the correct answers should do to evaluate the argument based on the reasoning. And we need to find something to help determine whether the evidence from the study is representative or can be reasonably interpreted in another way. So we will then want to process of eliminate based on our common wrong argumentation reasons. For instance, vague impact. So how the subjects were chosen, this introduces a whole new question. I don't know what the choice is going to have to do with this, so I can eliminate that pretty quickly. And then we have task reversals, which ultimately introduce additional issues to evaluate, such as how many of the subjects believe in psychics. Well, we're not talking about belief in psychics. We're being talked about a psychic intuition. So there's no way that belief in psychics is relevant definitively. We also have what time of day the experiment was conducted. Okay, wonderful. I have more questions than answers about the daytime. And then paid to participate, well, that may explain why they were in the study in the first place, but it doesn't necessarily tell us why they responded as they did to being asked if they were being watched from behind the window pane. But choice B, whether the window pane was soundproof. This may be a variable that you hadn't thought about, but the answer to the question will help determine if the argument seems valid. Because if the window pane was soundproof, well, then I would reasonably think that maybe they can't hear that somebody's behind the window pane. But if the window pane were not soundproof, then maybe, just maybe, the people aren't able to tell that they're being watched. They're able to hear when somebody is in that room. And so the answer to the question in choice B would help directly to evaluate the validity of the conclusion that they have a psychic intuition that has been corroborated by the study. So then we go back to our argumentation equation, and when we're being asked to evaluate the method of an argument, we basically need to just track the premise and the conclusion through the facts that are provided as support and the opinion that is requiring the support. So we want to carefully diagram our argument premises and the conclusion on our scratch pad, just basically to identify how the argument, or potentially arguments if there are multiple speakers, go from one position to another. And you only predict broadly by noting the facts and opinions presented in the argument, as well as how they, as premises or even intermediate conclusions, lead to the main conclusion of the argument. So we've got another example. And here we can see we've got multiple speakers, and that adds an extra level of complexity. So we've got recognize the key terms, as always, by looking at the question stem to start. So the politician responds to the philosopher by blank. Okay, so we've got to evaluate the method of response for the politician to the philosopher. And that indicates that we need to evaluate the argument, although it's just by basically determining how the arguments proceed. So we have to track the premises and conclusions of each speaker, starting with the philosopher. So we'll read the prompt and diagram the argument that's presented. So the philosopher states, the best leaders shape public opinion while challenging society's basest emotions and instincts. And this is just a conclusion, so I could take a shorthanded note that says PH.C for philosopher conclusion, best leaders shape opinion and challenge society, because this is an opinion of the philosopher without any supporting facts, which is strange and may kind of be disconcerting as a reader, but that's just what's been presented. So now we'll move on to the politician. While that may have been true in ancient times, the realities of modern democracy make it impossible to get elected on such a platform. Effective modern elected officials must instead mold their principles into moderated policies that the public is willing to adopt. Okay, so we see that the politician, just as a fact, states that what the philosopher said was true, but in ancient times. So, best leaders shaped opinion in ancient times, but now cannot, is the premise of the politician, which leads then to the politician's conclusion, illustrated by the PO.C, which is that effective modern officials must mold principles to public opinion. So, again, we've broken everything down and written it into our scratch pad as basically outlined through the argumentation equation. So then we'll process eliminate based on common wrong argumentation reasons, including vague impact based on B's use of the phrase more evolved than ancient society was. This introduces more confusion than answers. So I've got more questions now about what more evolved even means from the argument, so we can eliminate that. And our task reversal for method of argument evaluate tasks is that it basically incorrectly articulates the way that the argument proceeds. So for choice A, we've got demanding evidence in support of her claim, meaning that the politician demanded evidence of the philosopher, and that simply did not happen. While as a reader, we may have said, hey, you need some evidence, philosopher, for your conclusion that has no evidence. That's not what the politician did. So we can eliminate choice B because it doesn't, or choice A, because it isn't what the structure of our notes matches. So choice A is gone. Then choice D, using an analogy to prove the point moot. Well, no, there's no analogy here whatsoever. So we can get rid of choice D because that's simply, again, not what the politician does. And then choice E, lamenting that ancient times were better than those of the modern politician. Again, that sounds like something that a politician might do in modern times, but it is certainly not what this politician is doing in the argument. Whereas if we look at choice C, accepting certain tenets of her argument. Well, yes, the politician starts by saying that may have been true in ancient times that the best leaders shaped public opinion. But qualifying it for contemporary circumstances, well, that is certainly what the politician's conclusion does. And that makes choice C the correct answer. And we'd select it before moving on to the next one if this were the actual executive assessment exam. So, how do we work through these questions? First, note and identify and evaluate tasks by recognizing the key indicator terms and determine the specific type of evaluation required, because there are the two types that we talked about. You'll then want to read the prompt as written to determine a common type of argument, or note the premises and conclusion or conclusions in an argument diagram using that argumentation equation that we talked about. You're only going to predict more specifically for evaluate additional information to determine the validity evaluate task. So if you can find a common argument with this evaluate the validity of the conclusion evaluate task, you can more specifically predict what the relevant useful evidence might be. But if you cannot determine what a common argument is for evaluating the validity tasks, you can just use the generic prediction of find info to help determine if it's reasonable to conclude that whatever the conclusion was. And then step 4, of course, is to eliminate the choices against your additional info prediction or the argument diagram that you've written out using our common wrong answer reasons. So let's head on over to the whiteboard and take a look at an example of each of the types of evaluate tasks that you might encounter on the executive assessment. So here we have a sample critical reasoning style question. We're just going to write out A, B, C, D, E for process of elimination, and we can see that we're being asked for how the passage above proceeds. So we just need to find a way to evaluate the method of argument. So when we're being asked to evaluate the method, we know that we're going to need to talk about the premise and we're going to need to talk about the conclusion. So starting at the beginning, we've got governments often respond to public criticism of necessary social services by introducing additional regulations overseeing those services, and those regulations can lead to higher costs for consumers. So the premise is basically to set a standard of response for government and outcome is basically an increase in dollar cost. Then we have the public in the state of prime is actively criticizing government funded early child care services. But in this case, families should not necessarily expect to incur greater costs as a result. So we know that we've also got basically, if I give myself a little bit more room here, we've got more premise of just what's happening in prime. So we know that prime public is mad at, we'll just call it uh, GF, government funded CC, childcare. But the conclusion is that the cost is not expected to go up. And that goes directly contrary to what we have from the evidence. So this is an interesting structure in that they set a precedent and then basically say precedent isn't going to hold in the state of prime. So choice A, presenting a broadly accepted circumstance that its conclusion questions as a rule. Weirdly phrased, absolutely. But there is a broadly accepted circumstance that, government increases the regulations increase costs, but then we've got questions as a rule. Well, questions on an individual basis. So the second half is wrong. So this is basically a reversal of the task because we know that it doesn't question it as a rule. It just says there's an exception here. Now, considering alternative approaches to a common problem, that's definitely not what's happening. We know that there's clearly some alternative circumstance that's occurring, but there's no alternative approaches. I might even be able to say common problem. I don't know that this is necessarily a common problem. Theorizing about the cause of an outcome before questioning that explanation. Again, they don't really question anything in the general structure of this. They just say that it won't hold in this prime example. Positing a set of facts and presenting an exception to them, there we go. That's exactly what we were looking for. We know that we've got some facts that are stated at the beginning, but then there's this exception that's going to happen in prime. We don't know why, but it's being presented. And then arguing that a generally held principle needs an overall reevaluation. Well, no, again, we're not saying that it's wrong or anything. It's just saying that in the state of prime, this isn't expected to happen for reasons that haven't exactly been articulated. So our correct answer here would be choice D. So let's scroll on down and we'll take a look at one more example here. Frame that up a little bit. So setting up the scratch work, as always, we got A, B, C, D, E. And this time, we're being asked which of the following would be most useful to investigate for the purpose of determining if trust in judges will allow the public to have faith in the punishments for given crimes. So I actually already know what the conclusion is. It's basically all of this stuff after the if. But we've got this determine, we've got useful, these are indicating evaluate tasks. So I need to read the paragraph, and we just know that our predicted way to evaluate is somehow going to address whether the public will have faith in judges and punishing crimes. So starting from the beginning, determining an appropriate punishment for various crimes requires evaluating the intent of an individual who commits an illegal act. Okay. However, evidence of intent is much more difficult to obtain than is evidence of an act itself. Therefore, trust in judges is necessary for the public to have faith that reasonable punishments will be meted out in the courtroom. It's relatively abstract as an argument goes for the GMAT, but we can just use our broad prediction here and say find info to help determine if trust in J's for judges is needed for public faith in reasonable court punishments. So Relatively straightforward prediction, not going too deep into the specifics of the type of evidence because it's not all that clear, maybe, in this one. So, whether judges are generally capable of evaluating the character of defendants. Well, we're trying to evaluate the intent of the defendants. And if we shift the term to character, that's going to require additional information. So, we don't know how character relates to intent necessarily. So, we can eliminate that for the fact that it needs additional information here. So, then we got choice B, whether the public believes that judges are capable arbiters of criminal intent. Well, we're definitely concerned with judges and criminal intent. If I don't know what arbiters means, I have to put a question mark. If I do know what arbiters means, this might seem like the right answer already. Now, choice C, whether individual judges may levy different punishments in similar cases. Okay, may levy, that is incredibly vague. I don't know if it happens, how frequently, so that we can call vague and eliminate. Choice D, whether evidence of intent can be discovered in the course of an investigation. Well, we already know that. It just says it's more difficult to obtain. We don't need to know that it's impossible. This actually, if anything, is kind of a reversal of the facts. And whether juries are involved in determining punishment guidelines. Well, that too is going to introduce the new variable of juries and will require additional information. So our correct answer is B, because arbiter means judge, basically. And the judges are the ones that the public believes in, so they need to be able to determine whether intent existed or not from evidence or not, potentially, according to the prompt. So this is the two ways that you'll need to potentially evaluate arguments on the exam. Try some practice problems on your own to get better at these specific types of critical reasoning tasks.